Howdy, folks. Today I want to talk about the great crypto crash of 2022 and how the whole miserable thing has amounted to a speedrun of the 2008 financial crisis in miniature. But before I do that, I need to talk about a part of the 2008 crash that tends to be missed in popular discussions. Movies like The Big Short and Margin Call, there is detailed coverage of the housing bubble, how scumbag mortgage originators gave crap mortgages to people with bad credit, banks packaged the mortgages into securities, and people all over the world invested in them.
The fact is that these mortgage-backed securities are filled with extremely risky subprime adjustable rate loans, and when the majority of the adjustable rates kick in 07, they will begin to fail. And if they fail above 15%, the whole bond is worthless.
This created huge demand for more bad mortgages, which inflated the housing market. Eventually, the originators ran out of suckers, the housing market peaked, people with bad loans could no longer refinance, and the whole thing collapsed. In his masterpiece video on cryptocurrency and NFTs, Dan Olson gives a more sophisticated version of this explanation. The other big factor behind the 2008 crash that is commonly discussed is leverage. That one is simple enough. When a financial company borrows tons of money against very little capital, then it only takes a small loss to bankrupt them. If you have $3 million and you borrow $100 million to invest, if your portfolio tanks by just 3%, then you are bankrupt. When most financial firms are borrowing like this, it means a rickety financial system. Here's a chart from Wikipedia by Ben Moore showing the increase in leverage among investment banks from 2003 to 2007. I think by now most curious people are pretty familiar with the stories of the housing bubble and the danger of over-borrowing. But there is still a critical element missing, the role of panic in the shadow banking system. Remember the bank run from It's a Wonderful Life when the residents of Bedford Falls worry that the Bailey building and loan is going to collapse, and so they all ask for their money at the same time, nearly causing it to collapse?
We don't need Potter over here.
And I'll take mine now.
No, but You're thinking of this place all wrong, as if I had the money back in a safe. The money's not here. Well, your money's in Joe's house. That's right next to yours. And in the Kennedy house, and Mrs. Maitland's house, and 100 others. You're lending them the money to build, and then they're going to pay it back to you as best they can. Now, what are you going to do, foreclose on them?
A similar process was central to the 2008 crisis. This is a little technical, but stick with me here. It's important. Before 2008, many financial firms had come to rely on something called the wholesale funding market for their daily operations. Wholesale funding is just sources of money or credit that aren't traditional domestic bank deposits. One important kind is a thing called a repurchase agreement, or repo. Bracketing some complexity, this is when one firm sells an asset to another with an agreement to repurchase at the original price plus interest at some future date, maybe tomorrow, maybe in 3 months, depending on one's needs. At bottom, repo is basically just a type of loan with some asset as collateral. If the borrower defaults, the lender keeps the asset. But because there's a risk that the value of the asset might go down, the lending party doesn't pay the full face value. Say you repo $100 million of U.S. Treasury bonds for a month. Those bonds are the safest asset out there, so if you're a respected player yourself, you'll usually get almost the full value, something like $99.8 million in cash. But if you repo $100 million of the debt of a company in deep financial trouble, that is very risky, so you'll maybe get something like $50 to $60 million. The difference between the face value of the asset and the actual amount you get in cash is called a repo haircut. Here's a nice diagram from Farcaster on Wikipedia that shows all the parts. The asset has a face value of $100, a haircut of $20, and an interest payment of $8. By the mid-2000s, the amount of repo credit flowing through Wall Street reached multiple trillions of dollars per day. Here's a chart I borrowed from historian Adam Tooze's book Crashed, showing how it grew. Investment banks especially relied on rolling over their repo every day. Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch, we saw earlier, funded 40% of their asset portfolios through it. As the housing bubble was collapsing in 2008 and all those garbage mortgage-backed securities were going bad, firms with lots of exposure faced bigger and bigger haircuts. This process first took out Bear Stearns, one of these investment banks which was up to its armpits in subprime toxic waste. Its repo haircuts leaped up, even on its high-quality assets, because people didn't want to bother fishing out their asset in a bankruptcy proceeding, which meant that it had to put up more cash to roll over its repo. Bear burned through its liquidity reserve and had to sell itself to JP Morgan Chase for a pittance in a deal facilitated by the Federal Reserve. The same thing basically happened to Lehman Brothers, but nobody wanted to buy it, including the government, so it went bankrupt. This sparked galloping panic everywhere. As worry whether or not repo counterparties would remain solvent increased, all haircuts for any type of asset jumped up and up, which tightened credit across the whole financial system, which pushed many firms toward insolvency, which pushed haircuts up more, and so on. It was a self-perpetuating panic just like in Bedford Falls, except instead of individual depositors rushing to get cash, it was financial firms caught into a death loop of mutual fear and suspicion. In his book, Tooze cites data on how repo haircuts exploded upward in 2008. U.S. government debt went from 0.25% to 3%. Prime quality mortgage-backed securities went from 2 to 4% to 10 to 20%, and asset-backed securities in general went from 3 to 5% to 50 to 60%. So remember when AIG, the world's largest insurance company, was driven almost into bankruptcy and had to be nationalized by the Federal Reserve? This actually wasn't directly caused by subprime mortgage losses. They had written a bunch of very stupid insurance contracts on subprime bonds, but the direct losses only amounted to $11.5 billion. And those losses took months to start being processed anyway. They had also made other stupid gambles, but this wasn't a decisive factor either. What killed AIG was the financial panic. As its exposure to subprime became clear, its credit rating was downgraded, Tooze writes. This triggered immediate margin calls from the counterparties to AIG's insurance contracts. They wanted collateral to prove that AIG could meet its obligations if the mortgages did go bad. AIG had to produce tens of billions of dollars in cash while the global banking system was seizing up, which ate up its liquidity, which caused more collateral calls, and so on. If not for the Fed nationalizing it and taking many other steps to stabilize the repo market and the rest of the shadow banking system, the whole of Wall Street would have collapsed. So now we could talk about crypto. I'm not going to talk about the details for how the coins or blockchains work. If you're interested in that, go watch Dan's video. For my purposes, what matters is that while cryptocurrencies are supposed to be decentralized, a word that is practically a fetish object in the crypto community, they're all such a complicated pain in the ass that centralized third-party companies have sprouted up to allow normal people to actually buy and trade the coins. We have wallet managers like MetaMask, exchanges like Coinbase or Binance, and investment firms like Genesis Global Capital. Sam Bankman-Fried founded at both an exchange in FTX and a crypto hedge fund in Alameda Research. Once crypto got decently popular and started minting billionaires, these companies carefully cultivated mainstream legitimacy with a deluge of propaganda. They bought Super Bowl advertisements with A-list celebrities.
Like I was saying, it's FTX. It's a safe and easy way to get into crypto.
I don't think so.
4 simple words that have been whispered by the intrepid since the time of the Romans. Fortune favors the brave.
Convinced more celebrities to personally obtain and endorse crypto assets, sometimes with payments that were not disclosed in violation of the law, bought naming rights to professional sports stadiums, and on and on. Normal people surged into crypto markets almost entirely through these middlemen services. In retrospect, 2021 is probably going to be seen as the peak year of the crypto boom. In the spring, we had the NFT frenzy, and in the fall, we reached the all-time peak of the combined crypto market capitalization. With all that money, they started a huge lobbying operation in Washington, and sure enough, crypto shill members of Congress popped up in both parties. New York's Kristen Gillibrand and Wyoming's Cynthia Lummis proposed a regulatory bill that was practically written by the industry. But soon afterward, the trouble started. The highest inflation in 4 decades prompted the Federal Reserve to start raising interest rates. Tech companies that had thrived for a decade on cheap credit started to struggle, and the fact that supply chain troubles pushed capital to investment in logistics and manufacturing meant they struggled more. Crypto companies and the coins themselves struggled even more than this, probably because the underlying business is so much more ephemeral. It got worse when some government regulators belatedly started paying attention. The Securities and Exchange Commission started looking into several companies, and in February it settled a lawsuit against the crypto bank BlockFi for $100 million over it failing to register loan products according to U.S. law. By the way, the Blockchain 8, a bipartisan group of crypto shills in the House of Representatives, actually tried to get the SEC to back off. Anyway, this period was the beginning of a gathering crisis of confidence in the crypto space. In May, the Terra blockchain ecosystem suffered a run and imploded. Then in June, BlockFi and Voyager, a crypto brokerage, ran into trouble. FTX chief Sam Bankman-Fried bailed them out, which boosted his reputation as the legit good guy of crypto. Comparisons were made with JP Morgan's famous rescue of Wall Street in 1907. But in July, another lender called Celsius went bankrupt. That set the stage for the death of FTX. The details are still being sorted out as to what exactly happened, but the basic story has become reasonably clear. FTX was involved with a lot of these other companies, and on November 2nd, CoinDesk published a story revealing that Bankman-Fried's company Alameda Research had a balance sheet that was mostly made up of FTX's own token FTT. We'll see this kind of thing again in a minute. 4 days later, Binance, the biggest crypto exchange, announced it was selling off its stock of FTT. This caused a bank run as FTX's depositors rushed to withdraw their holdings. On the 8th, Binance announced that it would buy FTX to keep it from going bankrupt. But after cracking open the company's books, the next day it backed out of the deal. The following day, the Justice Department and the SEC announced they were opening investigations. On the 11th, the Wall Street Journal reported that FTX had taken billions of dollars in deposits and secretly given them to Alameda to make risky bets, which would be illegal. And this clarifies what happened with the FTX bank run I was just mentioning. FTX was supposed to be an exchange, not a bank. The whole idea was it would take your money and allow you to buy and sell crypto assets, not that it would take your money and invest it in other things. In fact, it specifically promised not to do that. So while FTX did suffer a bank run style crisis of confidence, that only destroyed the business because Sam Bankman-Fried was a liar and a thief. The Financial Times got a hold of FTX's balance sheet, and what they found beggars belief. A few things jumped out immediately. First, it supposedly had just $900 million in liquid assets against $9 billion in liabilities. But a lot of those assets were in coins that FTX itself had created and mostly held onto. It claimed $2.1 billion in Serum because that's the number you get if you multiplied the market price times the number of Serum coins it owned. But FTX and Alameda had about 2/3 of all these coins. The market value of all the coins held by the public was only about $200 million at the time. Obviously, if they actually had to unload these coins, it would obliterate the price. This almost certainly has to be called accounting fraud. But even worse than this was a spreadsheet cell labeled Hidden Poorly Internally Labeled Fiat at Account. Labeled. And this account read negative $8 billion. Let me quote financial journalist Matt Levine. If you try to calculate the equity of a balance sheet with an entry for hidden, poorly internally labeled account, Microsoft Clippy will appear before you in the flesh, bloodshot and staggering, with a knife in his little paperclip hand, saying, "Just what do you think you're doing, Dave?"
Stop, Dave. Will you stop, Dave?
You cannot apply ordinary arithmetic to numbers in a cell labeled hidden, poorly internally labeled account. The result of adding or subtracting those numbers with ordinary numbers is not a number, it is prison. A guy named John J. Ray, an attorney who oversaw some of the biggest bankruptcies in history, including Enron, was appointed FTX CEO after Sam Bankman-Fried resigned. In his statement, he wrote, "Never in my career have I seen such a complete failure of corporate controls and such a complete absence of trustworthy financial information as occurred here."
The biggest bag of odorous excrement ever assembled in the history of capitalism. Behold.
Every problem that brought down the bankers in 2008, all in one trash company plus more. We've got a firm hit by a systemic crisis of confidence within the crypto ecosystem itself, revealed to be engaged in highly leveraged and probably illegal speculation in risky assets, if not an actual Ponzi scheme, found to be in violation of every principle of sound business and accounting, and finally killed off by a 1920s-style bank run. And now, just as I'm writing this script, the contagion has spread to Genesis. Who knows whether or not the remaining crypto firms will survive into 2023, but if I had any money in anything crypto-related, I would get it out now, especially the stablecoins, but that's a subject for another video. Let me sum up here. Just like with the financial crisis in 2008, the details are complicated, but the broad strokes are quite simple. A bunch of computer geeks high in their own bullshit hype created a ludicrous simulacrum of a totally unregulated financial system, except worse. The whole thing is simply a breeding ground of theft, fraud, and scams, and we didn't even get a boom in housing construction like we did in the mid-2000s. You can live in a house, but all we got was tens of millions of perfectly good computer chips doing literally pointless math problems, largely fueled by pollution spewing fossil fuel energy. The social function of crypto turns out to be convincing a generation scarred by the financial crisis and therefore suspicious of traditional finance and home ownership that there is a magic new way to make free money gambling on the markets. Snazzy neologisms and mathematical gobbledygook allowed people to think this time is different until, inevitably, it wasn't. There's just one question remaining. Should the government stop the crypto meltdown? In It's a Wonderful Life, the building and loan is saved by George and his wife putting in $2,000 of their own money, which just barely staves off bankruptcy.
My husband hasn't worked in over a year, and I need money.
How am I going to live until the bank opens?
I got doctor bills to pay.
I need cash.
I can't keep my kids on faith. I've got to have...
How much do you need?
Hey! I got $2,000. They'll never close us up today. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Bingo! We made it. Close the door, Eustace. We made it. Look, we're still in business. We still got $2 left.
Today, we have permanently ended this type of financial panic in normal banks with a government backstop in the form of deposit insurance. The FDIC guarantees everyone with a normal bank account that their deposits are protected up to $250,000. As a result, people don't panic and cause a run even if a bank runs into problems. Most people agree this is good because ordinary banking is so useful. By the same token, the government rescued the shadow banking system in 2008 because so many actual real-life people and businesses were intertwined with it. If the Fed hadn't acted as the lender of last resort for Wall Street, it would have taken down half the economy with them. In central banking, there's something called Bagehot's rule, which says that during a crisis, the central bank should lend without limit to solvent firms against good collateral at high rates. People argue about this a lot, but the basic point is that if there is a galloping panic across the whole financial system, the central bank should provide that money, but only to institutions that would ordinarily be fine and not for free. You want to unclog the credit system, not to save banks that made stupid or predatory loans from their own mistakes. The problem with the 2008 bailout wasn't that it happened, it was that it was so absurdly generous to the people who caused the crash in the first place. The government nationalized AIG and then allowed its executives to pay themselves huge bonuses for driving their company into the ground. With one exception, it didn't prosecute any of the top executives of companies that defrauded customers and investors before the crisis, or those leading companies that committed industrial-scale mortgage document fraud after it. While it did pass new regulations, they were fairly weak and took years to implement. The government didn't just lend to solvent firms, they lent to absolute mountains of trash like Citigroup and at dirt cheap rates. President Obama even ordered his Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner to draw up a plan to wind down Citigroup, but Geithner straight up disobeyed him, and Obama characteristically didn't do anything. The government should have nationalized all the troubled firms, fired all the top executives, broken the companies into many pieces, and then maintained ownership for at least a decade so the taxpayer could benefit from the bailout too. All the criminals should have gone to prison. Instead of the weenie Dodd-Frank, it should have put up hard-assed regulations that would cut finance's share of GDP in half at least. Then instead of a half-sized Recovery Act, it should have passed a proper economic stimulus that would have restored full employment by 2010 instead of 2019. I could go on, but that's a subject for another video. But none of these crypto firms do anything to support the real economy. Not only are they almost certainly insolvent now, they probably never were solvent because they never did anything that produced value. When Kevin Roose, a New York Times reporter who fell hard for the crypto hype train, tried to find a company doing actual useful business with blockchain technology, the best he could do was a small firm called Helium, selling medium-range wireless internet. Wouldn't you know it, this later turned out to be deeply entangled with FTX, and its coin is falling like a stone. But the strongest evidence of crypto's uselessness is that the ongoing meltdown is not causing any knock-on problems in the rest of the financial system. A few firms and pension funds did lose tons of money, but there's no hint of panic. And this makes sense. Look at FTX and Alameda. They had billions of dollars in real money and invested it in other crypto magic beans. Probably because trying to put it into real companies would have raised regulator attention. If they had put all their money in actual companies, we might be in much worse trouble. If we were to set up a regulatory regime for crypto, it would allow these companies to insinuate themselves into the real financial system such that they become systematically important, like some parasite attaching itself to your aorta. Crypto does not need to become safe and regulated. It needs to be put down. So let me co-sign this argument from Stephen Cacchetti and Kim Schoenholtz in the Financial Times. The overriding goal of policymakers should be to keep crypto systemically irrelevant. The best way to do this is to let it implode under the pressure of its unsafe and unsound business practices. Meanwhile, authorities should constantly point to the record that crypto is rife with failures and fraud. Rather than creating a new legal and regulatory framework that legitimizes crypto, we should simply let it burn. The only regulation crypto needs is a ban on advertising and heavy warning labels for retail investors, and for all these crypto criminals who swindled their customers to be put in jail. It's not the government's job to completely prevent you from doing harmful things to yourself, but it can still stop Matt Damon and Larry David from tricking people into flushing their life savings down the toilet. That's all for today, folks. If you like this one, the best way to support the channel is to buy a copy of my book. You can also subscribe to my newsletter if you like, or follow me on Twitter, at least for the next couple of days till it collapses. Until next time.